The scariest ruler is not always the loud lunatic, weirdly. Sometimes it is the one who makes evil sound tidy, sensible, efficient. History has plenty of cruel men. Give one a crown, an army, and absolutely no consequences, and wow, civilization gets experimental fast. But some rulers did not stop at ordinary tyranny. No, they sprinted past it, then kept going, like evil had performance bonuses. We are talking family murder, corpse decor, towers of skulls, and somehow, unbelievably, that still is not the worst part. At first, evil looks messy, emotional, human, almost familiar, which is a truly awful sentence to have to say. Then it gets organized, counted, managed. And that, honestly, is worse. Because once cruelty learns paperwork, everybody should start sweating. So let us begin with a man built almost perfectly for disaster, trauma, ambition, terrible parenting, and, unfortunately for everyone, Rome. Officially, he was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, which sounds less like a person and more like a medication warning. To history, he is Nero, infamous emperor, last Julio-Claudian ruler, and proof that giving absolute power to a teenager is risky. His childhood was a mess, which is always comforting when discussing future emperors. Nothing says stability like grief, exile, and palace murder. When Nero was still very young, his father died. A bad start, obviously, and somehow not even the most alarming part. Then his mother, Agrippina, got exiled after being tied to political murder around Caligula's court, which is not ideal family communication. Then Caligula gets killed, Agrippina comes back, and Rome basically acts like this seems manageable, which is ambitious thinking. She marries Emperor Claudius, who was also her uncle because Rome treated boundaries like optional decorations, not rules. And just like that, little Nero goes from unlucky child to heir to the entire empire. Totally normal escalation, apparently. That rise was not an accident. Agrippina wanted power very specifically, and even more specifically, power through her son. She pushed, manipulated, removed obstacles, and somehow Claudius later dies under very suspicious circumstances. Classic Roman coincidence, obviously. Suspicious in the very specific Roman sense of, wait, did somebody maybe poison the emperor's mushrooms and call it politics? Nobody proved it, of course, but Agrippina was not exactly removed from suspicion, which is a very graceful Roman way to say, then another obstacle disappears. Britannicus, Nero's stepbrother and rival claimant, also dies mysteriously, because this family really hated peaceful succession. And Rome looks at all this poison-soaked chaos, sees a 16-year-old boy, and says, yes, emperor. Astonishing civic judgment, honestly. Now here is what makes Nero interesting. He does not begin as a full cartoon villain, which would almost be easier. Early in his reign, he actually does some things that sound oddly decent. Lower taxes, less execution, aid, rights, culture. For one brief second, it becomes annoyingly possible to ask, wait, is Nero about to be reasonable for once? No, absolutely not. Because under the polished beginning, the usual poison is still bubbling. Vanity, insecurity, appetite, resentment, paranoia, and hovering over all of it is Agrippina, who refuses to stop looming over his rule like a bloodthirsty stage mother. She expects influence. Nero expects obedience. That combination was never going to age gracefully, or peacefully, or really survivably. Then Nero gets involved with Poppaea Sabina, who was already married because, naturally, ordinary scandal was apparently too boring for this court. It becomes that special kind of ugly palace drama that only happens when everyone involved has too much power and emotional stability is missing. Agrippina hates it. She wants Nero stable, manageable, useful, and Poppaea threatens every one of those lovely controlling ambitions. Nero, meanwhile, is older now, more arrogant, less patient, and increasingly uninterested in being managed like an imperial puppet. So he solves the problem the Roman imperial way. He has his mother killed, which, yes, should have alarmed everyone immediately. According to later accounts, he first tried to make it look accidental, because even murder apparently needed branding. There are stories about a collapsing boat, which is such an absurdly specific cover story that it somehow becomes worse. Like, really? Your answer to family conflict is a custom-built murder boat? That is not a sentence healthy civilizations should produce. And once that line is crossed, something in Nero comes loose. After that, he does not just rule badly. He unravels. He divorces Octavia, exiles her, then has her killed, because apparently even ordinary cruelty needed extra administrative steps. Ancient sources say her head was later delivered like a grotesque trophy, which is the sort of detail that ruins a room forever. Rivals disappear. Friends disappear. Enemies disappear. Under a ruler like this, inconvenience slowly graduates into a capital offense. And somehow the strangest part is that Nero keeps performing. He does not just want power, he wants applause. He loves music, theater, spectacle, admiration. Not content with being emperor, he wants to be worshipped as an artist too. Which sounds harmless until you remember he can kill people who do not clap hard enough. Suddenly the arts feel less relaxing. And no, that is not really a metaphor. That is the problem with rulers like Nero. Insecurity starts writing policy. Then comes the event that permanently scorches his name into history: the Great Fire of Rome. In 64 AD, a massive fire tears through the city. Districts vanish, homes burn, people die, and panic spreads everywhere. And almost immediately, the rumors begin. Did Nero start it? Because once your reputation gets bad enough, suspicion barely needs evidence. Ancient sources disagree, which is history's favorite way of saying, well, everyone thought something was deeply wrong here. Some say yes, some say maybe. Some say he simply used the disaster, which is hardly a comforting alternative. That is the problem with building your image out of cruelty and instability. Eventually, even the rumors start sounding completely believable. There is that famous image of Nero playing music while Rome burned. Probably not literally true, but emotionally, oh, it landed. The fiddle did not even exist yet, which is rude to the myth, but not especially helpful to Nero's reputation. People believed it because it felt like something Nero would do, and that is how thoroughly poisoned his image had become. Whether he started the fire or not, many believed he wanted parts of Rome cleared away so he could rebuild it grander. More beautiful, more worthy of himself. Which is such a hideous kind of ruler logic. Not save the people, redesign the tragedy, and there is the pattern. Nero is what happens when power lands on top of vanity and fear, then gets dressed up as leadership. At first he looks promising, then unstable, then dangerous, then monstrous. It is basically a political horror story with very expensive robes. By the end, Rome is not being ruled by a statesman at all. It is being ruled by a performance. Eventually, even the Roman Senate has had enough. Nero is declared a public enemy, and suddenly support evaporates everywhere. Allies vanish. Loyalty collapses. The empire he treated like a personal stage finally turns around and boos. And when the walls close in, Nero does what many tyrants do when humiliation becomes unavoidable. He chooses death. So ends Nero. Hopeful young emperor turned symbol of imperial rot, which is one spectacularly disastrous career arc. But here is the disturbing part. Nero was chaotic, emotional, impulsive. The next ruler is colder than that, much colder. Because killing enemies is one thing. Inviting them in, forgiving them, then turning their bodies into a museum display? Yes, that is Ferrante. This is Ferdinand I of Naples called Ferrante, a man who somehow looks less like a nightmare king than a disappointed innkeeper, which weirdly makes him worse. History's monsters do not always arrive looking dramatic. Sometimes they just look tired and patient. Ferrante was the illegitimate son of Alfonso the Magnanimous of Aragon, and he inherits Naples in the mid-15th century. To be fair, briefly, he was not incompetent. There were stretches of peace and stability, so this is not accidental stupidity. No, Ferrante knew exactly what he was doing, which is always much less comforting than a ruler simply being an idiot. What he wanted was a reputation so poisonous that even imagining betrayal would start to feel physically unsafe. because Ferrante had a very simple policy toward enemies: forgive nothing, forget nothing, and make the consequences unforgettable. Early in his reign, nobles rebel against him, which in fairness was basically standard medieval noble behavior at this point. There is a king, some taxes, one bruised ego at dinner, and suddenly half the country is apparently wearing armor again. Ferrante crushes the revolt, which, fine. Kings do that. Medieval politics was not exactly a consent-based workshop. But what matters is what happens after. Because with Ferrante, the punishment is never the whole point. The memory is. Years later, Naples faces a real crisis when the Ottomans invade in 1480, which tends to sharpen everyone's priorities very quickly. Ferrante needs money, troops, loyalty, cooperation, basically all the things rebellion is extremely bad at providing during an invasion. So taxes rise, pressure rises, resentment rises, and once the Ottomans are pushed back, the nobles rebel again. Remarkable timing, really. A normal ruler might punish a few leaders, seize some land, execute a handful, then move on with his life. Ferrante is not interested in normal. He wants theater, memory, staging, consequences with room decor energy. So he offers amnesty, which is one of those tiny words that becomes much more sinister once attached to the wrong ruler. He invites the rebels in, says the past is the past, let us reconcile, let us be civilized. And somehow they believe him, because once the rebels are safely within reach, Ferrante has them arrested and killed, which is a remarkably aggressive interpretation of reconciliation. That alone would already be terrible. But Ferrante, being Ferrante, somehow looks at terrible and decides it lacks presentation value. Because when he sees dead political enemies, he apparently thinks, you know what this situation needs? Better staging, more atmosphere, a display strategy. So he has their bodies mummified, which is not a normal royal policy, interior design choice, or frankly acceptable sentence. Stuffed, dressed, displayed. Every word somehow makes the room colder, which feels rude considering the bodies were already dead. Just let that sit there for a second. This man turned dead rivals into decor, which is power mixed with deeply cursed taste. Most kings wanted loyalty. Ferrante, apparently, wanted ambiance. Something between political dominance and the worst museum planner who ever lived. He keeps these preserved enemies in what became known as his Black Museum, a grotesque collection built to intimidate and warn, and maybe, somehow, to satisfy whatever broken part of his mind thought interior design should come with dead rivals and psychological damage. Imagine walking into a royal room and realizing the silent figures around you are not statues. That is a truly aggressive hospitality strategy. They are people, or what used to be people. At that point, punishment is no longer punishment. It is set design with trauma. And weirdly, it probably worked, because cruelty with staging reaches deeper than ordinary violence ever really needs to. It tells everyone who sees it that punishment will not end with death. Death is just where Ferrante's message begins. That is what makes him so disturbing. Not just that he kills, but that he understands psychology, memory, and visual terror. He knows a corpse can still do a job, which is one of the bleakest management philosophies ever invented. Now, compared with rulers like Timur or Leopold, Ferrante's body count may not be the highest on this list. But that almost misses the point, because evil does not scale only through numbers. Sometimes it scales through imagination. And Ferrante had imagination. Dark, moldy, deeply theatrical imagination. Which brings us to Timur, where brutality becomes almost inhumanly large, also known as Tamerlane. And before we even reach the massacres, his backstory already feels like history carefully assembling a villain kit. As a young man, Timur is badly injured, one wound to the leg, another to the hand, and the damage stays with him for life. He walks with a limp. That is where the title Timur the Lame comes from, which sounds historical until the body count arrives. And if you think that detail softens what comes next, absolutely not. It just makes the contrast more unsettling. Because whatever limits Timur had physically, he more than compensated for with military brilliance, ambition, and calculated violence on a terrifying scale. By the early 15th century, he had built an empire across Central Asia, Persia, parts of the Middle East, South Asia, and beyond. Not bad for a man whose body had every excuse to slow down and who instead chose continental devastation as a profession. He conquered fast, he punished hard, and he understood one very old, very ugly truth. Fear travels faster than armies, which meant terror itself became part of the strategy, not a side effect, not an accident. The strategy. Cities facing Timur did not merely fear defeat, they feared erasure, the kind that turns resistance into a warning for everyone else. They feared that resistance would not simply fail, but be answered so brutally that 10 other cities might surrender from the rumor alone. And that brings us to Isfahan, a wealthy Persian city full of art, architecture, philosophy, all the lovely things conquest tends to trample, which also made it valuable, unfortunately. Human achievement has always had this awful habit of attracting men who want to own it. Timur arrives, the city surrenders, which is sensible when the alternative is testing optimism against a military nightmare. At first, there is a little mercy, or at least the grim discount version of mercy available under Timur. There is looting, occupation, soldiers left behind to maintain control. But the population survives briefly, which almost feels like relief. For one moment, surrender seems to have worked. And history, annoyingly, does that sometimes right before it gets much worse. Then locals kill several of Timur's soldiers. And that is where the story stops feeling darkly fascinating and starts feeling cold. Because Timur comes back, and he does not come back angry in the ordinary human sense. He comes back with accounting. Not messy revenge, not heat-of-the-moment rage. This is measurable punishment, scalable vengeance, cruelty with a system behind it. He orders a massacre, not of the guilty, but of everyone, which is where power empties itself of any remaining excuse. Men, women, children, entire households erased because a smaller group fought back. That is not justice, it is extermination logic. According to accounts, soldiers were given quotas for how many heads they had to bring in. Miss the number, lose your own. And there it is, murder with paperwork. Once violence gets counted, assigned, processed, and measured, something colder has arrived. Soon the dead are everywhere. Then come the towers, skulls stacked into monuments so the warning can outlive the victims. A city becomes a message. Submit, or this is you. Brutality simplified into architecture. Horror turned into public signage. And just when you think the story has reached the human limit, some accounts push further. Children trampled as mercy is ignored. That is not victory. That is power stripped down until nothing remains except domination, scale, and the complete absence of mercy. By the end of Timur's campaigns, millions are dead. Some estimates land around 17 million, which barely feels numerically human anymore. That number is so huge the mind almost refuses it, so the only honest way to grasp it is to shrink it first. One city, one family, one child, then multiply until your thoughts begin resisting the arithmetic. That is Timur's shadow. He is not just a conqueror, he is a machine for turning rebellion into spectacle and cities into examples. So now the question gets uglier. What is worse, the impulsive monster, the theatrical sadist, or the strategist of mass death? Because history somehow still has another answer. And yes, against all good judgment, it gets worse from here. Before we continue, here is the pattern of damage so far. Nero gave us chaos, Ferrante gave us theater, Timur gave us scale. So now the pattern shifts again because not every monster rules through conquest. Some rule through decay and appetite. Which brings us to ancient China, where the next ruler does not need towers of skulls or preserved enemies to wreck a kingdom. Long before later imperial China, there is the Xia dynasty, the first traditional dynasty in Chinese history, and it ends badly. Because like so many dynasties, it runs into the classic problem of a ruler who mistakes the state for a personal toy box. This is King Jai of Xia, a man who can look at a struggling kingdom and somehow conclude it needs more indulgence, more luxury, more pleasure, more terrible decisions. Maybe, incredibly, a literal lake of wine. Yes, history really went there. Jai earns a reputation for cruelty, extravagance, and the kind of ego that usually appears right before a government implodes. He is not interested in wisdom, restraint, or boring things like long-term stability. He wants pleasure now and consequences later. So while a decent ruler might protect borders or strengthen the state, Jai goes the opposite way. Palace upgrades, entertainment, indulgence. And when the money runs thin, simple, raise taxes. Because under a bad ruler, the people stop being citizens and become wallets. And when even taxes are not enough, G turns outward. Smaller neighboring peoples become emergency funding with worse branding. They get raided, attacked, stripped of wealth and women, because pillaging is apparently easier than governing or budgeting responsibly. That already makes him parasitic. But then history adds the detail that turns ordinary rot into something almost absurdly decadent. A woman named Mo Shi becomes the center of his obsession. And once that happens, the kingdom is basically being run by infatuation. He is captivated, ruled by desire, desperate to impress her, which is usually terrible in private and catastrophic in government. So now national wealth starts getting burned on increasingly deranged displays of affection, which never goes well for anyone paying taxes. One story says Jai orders a lake dug out and filled with wine so he and Mo Shi can drift around in it. Yes, a literal wine lake. Outside the palace, people are squeezed dry, and inside the king is floating through luxury nonsense. And because history apparently had not done enough already, thousands of men are said to have been ordered to drink from it. Which sounds absurd, unless you are the one financing it, serving it, or collapsing beside it. Then somehow the joke curdles instantly. Then there is the silk. Because apparently luxury still had room to become even more embarrassing and wasteful. Mo Shi, according to the stories, enjoys the sound of tearing silk, not wearing it, just hearing expensive fabric rip. So Jai, in one of history's most pathetic royal performances, orders fine silk brought in just so he can tear it for her. Imagine ruling an entire dynasty and using national wealth to make your crush go, "Oh, nice. That tore well." Astonishing governance. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the kingdom is paying the bill. Taxes rise again, burdens grow heavier, legitimacy starts quietly rotting away. This is a quieter evil than Timur, less explosive, less spectacular, but still poisonous because selfishness can ruin a state from within. A ruler does not need to massacre a city to become destructive. Sometimes he just makes himself the center of reality. And once everyone else becomes supporting staff in the ruler's fantasy, the dynasty is already halfway to collapse. Eventually, enough people have had enough. Neglected subjects and nearby powers start shifting toward a rival because rot does create openings. That rival is Tang of Shan. And this is what happens when rulers confuse indulgence with strength for far too long. They do not notice the floor disappearing until they are already falling, which is a terrible time to discover reality again. Tang builds support, Tang builds power, Tang builds an army. Meanwhile, Jie is still busy being spectacularly useless at consequences, and then Jai loses everything. By around 1600 BC, the Zhe dynasty falls not with glory, but with exhaustion and failure. After centuries of rule, it ends with a ruler remembered mainly for waste, lust, cruelty, and collapse. Not exactly a flattering memorial. Jai dies not as an immortal terror, not as some unbeatable legend, but as a defeated man stripped of power. Which is almost satisfying. Almost. Because the relief does not last, and the final ruler on this list is colder than all of them. He does not unravel like Nero, preserve fear like Ferrante, crush cities like Timur, or rot a kingdom like Jie. He manages cruelty. This brings us to Leopold II of Belgium, a king whose evil is so cold, systematic, and profitable it still stains memory. When people think of Belgium, they think waffles, chocolate, beer, which is unfortunate because genocide is part of that story too. In the late 19th century, Europe is carving up Africa with breathtaking confidence and absolutely terrible moral instincts. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, borders are negotiated by men who do not live there, belong there, or care very much. Leopold sees opportunity. Not responsibility, not duty, certainly not benevolence. Just opportunity wrapped in very polished language. He wants the Congo, enormous, resource-rich, and far enough away to be described as a noble mission by liars in suits. So he packages the whole thing as philanthropy, progress, free trade, civilization, the usual elegant fraud vocabulary, and somehow it works. Under that humanitarian wrapping, Leopold secures control of the Congo Free State for himself, which is one of history's nastiest jokes because there is absolutely nothing free about it. Not the land, not the people, nothing. And it gets worse because the Congo is not even a Belgian colony at first. It is effectively Leopold's personal possession, a private empire, which is already such a morally rancid concept that the rest almost unfolds by itself. That matters because this is not just vague colonial abuse floating through a system. It is ownership, greed, and distance concentrated in one ruler. Leopold never has to stand in the mud himself. He can stay in Europe while other men do the terror for him. At first, the goal is extraction. Ivory, wealth, trade. The usual polite words that always seem to hide a whip nearby. Then global demand for rubber explodes, and suddenly the Congo is no longer merely useful. It becomes a fortune made of forests and bodies. Rubber becomes the obsession. Output must rise, quotas must be met, profits must flow, and now brutality starts looking administrative. Because once a ruler sees an entire population mainly as labor to be squeezed, cruelty stops being a tantrum and becomes a system. And that is where the story turns from dark to unbearable, because the machine is finally ready to show what it was built for. Before the final drop, here is the damage trail again. Nero was chaotic, Ferrante made cruelty theatrical, Timur scaled terror, GA rotted a kingdom, and now we arrive somewhere colder. Not louder, not bloodier in style, colder, evil as a functioning system. That is what makes Leopold so hard to sit with. He does not feel like a raving emperor in a burning palace. He feels modern, which is somehow more alarming than madness because modern evil knows how to file documents and smile politely. He feels administrative, official, structured, like cruelty has discovered offices, signatures, and a very calm tone of voice. He feels like the kind of evil that can wear a suit, discuss progress, and still leave millions dead behind the paperwork. That is the shift here, not fury, not spectacle, not indulgence, process, procedure, efficiency with a corpse count. And once suffering starts being measured by output instead of horror, the machine no longer needs rage to keep moving. It just needs management, which is exactly why Leopold may be the most disturbing ruler on this entire list. Under Leopold's rule, local leaders in the Congo are forced into compliance, bent toward one purpose only: extraction. Work, output, rubber, more rubber. Once human lives get translated into quotas, cruelty starts sounding like management advice. And to enforce that reality, Leopold relies on a colonial army called the Force Publique, which already sounds bureaucratic enough to be dangerous. That is part of the horror. Once violence gets a uniform, a payroll, and official stationery, it starts pretending to be legitimate. Villages are ordered to meet rubber quotas. If they fail, punishment follows. Beatings, kidnappings, raids, executions, the full administrative package. Entire communities are terrorized into compliance, and the punishment is not abstract. It arrives at the door, in the field, inside the family. Hands are cut off. And yes, that detail is as infamous as it deserves to be because some symbols do not need embellishment. Soldiers are expected to account for ammunition use, sometimes by producing severed hands as proof a bullet was not wasted. Which means mutilation becomes procedure, routine, bookkeeping with body parts, as if cruelty had finally completed its office training. If workers fail, they can be whipped. If villages resist, they can be burned. If families flee, hostages can be taken. Everything has a form. Women are imprisoned. Children are separated. Hunger gets weaponized. Fear becomes normal, which may be the most chilling sentence in the whole story. And while all of this happens, Leopold remains far away in Europe, clean, distant, civilized, the perfect costume for indirect horror. He does not need to see broken bodies or empty villages. He just needs the reports, the quotas, and the profits to keep arriving. That is what makes him feel modern. He does not swing the whip himself. He supervises the conditions that make someone else do it. And that reveals the final evolution of the evil this story has been climbing toward, which is somehow less emotional and more efficient. Nero wanted attention. Ferrante wanted fear. Timur wanted submission. Jai wanted pleasure. Leopold wanted yield. And that may be colder than all of them, because once people become production units, suffering no longer interrupts the system. It powers it. That is the most horrifying shift here. Human pain stops being collateral damage and becomes the fuel source. Forced labor shatters daily life across the Congo, because people are dragged away from sustaining their own communities and pushed into extraction. That means farming collapses in many areas, food disappears, hunger spreads, and the system naturally treats that like a side effect. Disease follows, social structures break apart, orphans multiply. Children get absorbed into missions and military systems because horror likes efficiency. Entire ways of life are damaged or erased under the pressure of colonial violence, which is a very tidy phrase for civilizational wreckage. And then there is the death toll. Historians argue over the exact number, partly because systems this brutal do not keep honest books. But the most cited estimate is staggering. Roughly 5 to 10 million Congolese die under Leopold's rule over the Congo Free State. That range is horrifying on its own, because once the number of dead has to be spoken in millions, grief starts losing its edges. Scale does that. It blurs mourning, numbs imagination, and makes catastrophe sound abstract when it was suffered one body at a time. And it was hidden for far too long. But not forever. Eventually, missionaries, witnesses, and investigators begin dragging the truth into view. Reports spread, testimonies spread, images spread. The outside world becomes harder and harder to fool, which is very inconvenient for polished evil. Writers like Mark Twain and Arthur Conan Doyle add their voices, and suddenly Leopold's humanitarian costume starts slipping in public. Pressure builds until, in 1908, control of the Congo Free State is finally taken from Leopold and handed to the Belgian state. But even then, the ending refuses to be clean, because systems like this rarely collapse without trying to tidy the evidence first. Before losing control, Leopold works to destroy records of what had been done. Of course he does. Curation is the final reflex, not regret, not remorse. Just control the archive, burn the trail, polish the image, and hope history stays confused long enough. Leopold dies in 1909, and by then public disgust has grown so strong that his funeral is met with jeers and boos, which feels appropriate. Not sufficient, obviously, but appropriate. Because no ceremony can clean the arithmetic of that system. And that leaves the question hanging over the whole list. Who was worst? The mad emperor, the theatrical sadist, the conqueror, the parasite, or the manager? Honestly, it depends what kind of evil terrifies you most. Madness, theater, conquest, decay, or the manager who makes suffering look reasonable.